Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Paul Schnackenburg on the line. Today we're talking about the vastness and complexity of the Microsoft Defender ecosystem. Now, there's lots more than just the Defender on endpoints that we've known and had in our client operating systems for years and years. There's Defender for Cloud, there's Defender for Office 365, there's Defender for IoT, and lots more. Not only that, there's a ton of, I guess what I would call Defender adjacent products and services that tie into Defender in various ways. And this just adds to the complexity and vastness of the ecosystem as well, right? So we're going to be talking about that. We're also going to talk about when you should look for a third party to kind of fill in some of those gaps and provide some additional value for you and your organization. So that and lots more in today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and with me I got Paul Schnackenburg. How's it going, Paul?
I'm good, thanks, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. Hey, you're my regular recurring guest co-host, honorary co-host of the whole show, I'm going to say at this point.
Okay,
so
thanks.
Right. And then, I'm going to skip your usual introduction because, if people don't know who you are at this point, I'm not sure. So anyway, this episode, I feel like we've talked about it on and off through a collection of different episodes. We've mentioned it here and there, but this is the first time that we are going to focus on all things Microsoft Defender. Now,
Yep.
There was a time when you said Microsoft Defender and it was like an endpoint security solution. Well, it wasn't even, I'm not even sure I would classify it as that. It was baked into Windows Client OS and it was AV anti-malware, basically, right?
Yep. Still there.
Of course, it's still there. It is still there, indeed. And of course, now we have all these different things. And I guess I don't know. This is a trend I've had the last couple of episodes where, like, I'm starting each episode with a story that led to the episode, right? And I had to work on a project where I was looking at basically everything in the Defender suite, right? And it's been a while since I've gone through the practice of actually looking at Defender and all the bits and bobs and the various pieces of it. And I knew it was extensive and I knew there was going to be a lot, but I didn't quite realize how a lot there is, right? And so this kind of reminds me of our licensing episode way back when. It was around 10, 11, 13, somewhere in that area. I'll link it in the show notes, folks. But this is complex, it's difficult, and it's problematic for those folks that have to manage it, right? And so I figured we would talk through the Defender ecosystem today, a quick overview of all the various Defenders that are out there, the confusion and complexity that comes with that, management tool sprawl, and all kinds of different things. So what do you think, Paul? Should we dive into it with an overview here, I think?
Yeah, let's. It's an interesting topic, and I hope it's going to be useful for our listeners and viewers, perhaps.
It should. And I think just by virtue of listing all the different Defenders that are out there is helpful. And I've got my list here, and I'm just we can start at the top and start moving down. And I've got Defender XDR at the top of my list, but I'm going to come back to that one. And folks that are not familiar with it will understand why.
Yep.
So I'm going to start with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, which is kind of what I talked about a little bit already. I would say it's more enterprise-ish today than it was before, right? Paul, why don't you tell us about that?
Right. So on Windows Endpoint, even if you buy a home computer, it never runs any kind of pro or enterprise version of Windows at all. You have Defender Antivirus. It is Microsoft's built-in anti-malware solution that has been in Windows for quite a few versions now. It's also built in server. That solution does not have any centralized management, and it's not an endpoint detection and response. It's not an EDR solution. So on top of that, on Windows, you put Defender for Endpoint. And that comes in P1, P2, and in Business Premium. And there's slight differences between all of them. Basically, if you want to summarize it quickly for a podcast, P1 is the cheap, very limited one that you don't really want unless you have no other choice. P2 is the bells and whistles, got everything in it, a very competent EDR, competitive with all the others on the planet today. And then Business Premium actually offers a lot of the good stuff out of P2, but for smaller businesses up to 300 users. It doesn't support Linux servers, and it doesn't do advanced hunting, KQL queries against the data. But other than that, it really has nearly every other feature you would want in it. So Business Premium is good. Defender for Endpoint also covers all the other platforms. So here, of course, it's not built in. So the point to remember about Windows is that you don't actually deploy it on Windows. You just onboard, because the bits are already in Windows. So it's just a matter of unlocking it from a license point of view. Mac OS, you install an agent, gives you a great EDR on Mac OS as far as Mac OS lets you do, because it's only API access.
Right.
Also runs on iOS, iPad OS, Android. Again, slight limitations there, but they are sort of more platform limitations because of what you can and can't do on the iOS and Android platform. And finally, it runs on Linux servers as well. So that's Defender for Endpoint.
Right. And there's one thing I want to point out here, and I've seen this come up in online conversations. I've seen it come up over beers and coffee. I'm going to come back to this point on a couple of different times throughout this episode. Everybody on that watches the show or listens to the show, they know I love Microsoft, right? But they're horrible at naming things. They are horrible at naming things. And once upon a time, not so long ago, this product was actually called Microsoft Defender ATP.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most people out there associate advanced threat protection with email security, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that threw people off, and maybe that's why they renamed it to Defender for Endpoint. It's much better than being called Defender ATP. But anyway, I still see in the documentation, I still see some mentions of Defender ATP.
And you still see that name in other places as well, because not only was this Defender ATP, but there was also Defender ATP for Office 365 and Defender for ATP for Identity. And if you look at the executables, which we'll come to in a second on the domain controllers, they still say ATP. Overall, I think the answer to that is that Microsoft renaming products is a function of two things: having way too many marketing people. Like half the time, whenever you talk to anybody at Microsoft, they work in marketing, which I think is insane. Way too many marketing people. And secondly, it's because them renaming things makes hundreds of blog posts, hundreds of podcasts, hundreds of videos, everybody talking about it, and all the consultants have something to keep up with, which then means that they get more eyes, more attention than anybody else in the industry. I'm sure there is a psychological reason behind the scenes why they're doing it.
That's very true. And you mentioned Microsoft 365, which brings me to the next Defender on our list here. And this naming is interesting to me. Mm-hmm. Microsoft Defender for Office 365. Now, we've talked on this show about how the Office brand is officially dead, right? But there's still some legacy Office licensing SKUs out there. Mm-hmm. And this is the only Defender that has any link to the old Office branding, right? And of course, this Defender is protection for email and collaboration tools, which includes phishing protection. And so the way I always explain this to folks is whenever you sign up for 365, even if it's just Exchange Online Plan 1, literally just a mailbox, you get Exchange Online Protection, which is kind of your run-of-the-mill basic email security solution, right? And Office 360 Defender for Office 365 builds on top of that with a couple of additional things. Anything you want to mention specifically here, Paul?
Again, comes in P1, P2. It's part of Business Premium. Right. And as you said, it covers Teams as well, which is kind of interesting. If you're getting phishing links and things sent to you in Teams, it'll catch that as well. Does safe links and safe attachments. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, it's pretty run of the mill, pretty standard. And I think, yeah. I'm not sure I have anything more to say about that particular one than that. It is what it is, right? So
it is very much so.
And I think you mentioned P1, P2, Business Premium. Just more of a comment on just licensing all of these together. Complex, right? Because we have to figure out if I want specifically Defender for Endpoint. Do I need P1? Do I need P2? Am I paying for a bundle that already comes with? Is it included in E3? No. Is it included in E5? What about business? So I have to go do all of that digging if I am considering, licensing any of these. Anyway,
you do, or you hire a consultant to do it for you.
Right.
Like me. Anyway,
right.
Go on.
Next one on our list is Microsoft Defender for Identity, and this one threw me initially because Microsoft has been so cloud focused that you assume anything Defender minus the endpoint probably has something to do with the cloud. This is actually in regards to on-premises Active Directory accounts. Could you give us a little bit more details on that?
So this was an acquisition quite some years ago. Israeli company, used to be called Advanced Threat Analytics, and it was like an on-premises product you actually ran on premises, but it has now moved completely to the cloud. Defender for Identity, you put agents on your domain controllers, on your ADFS servers, Federation services, and on your Entra ID Connect servers. All of that feeds into the cloud models, and they will detect lateral movement and other attacks against your Active Directory on premises. It is a really good product. Like if the attackers are on your network and they're moving laterally, this thing will detect it. It's one of those where you don't want to get an alert from, because if you're getting alert, you know that somebody's actually on your network properly. So
the fox is in the hen house.
Definitely. I will just clarify again here, just because what you said about on-premises versus cloud. So the equivalent in the cloud is called identity protection. So Entra ID, or used to be called Azure ID, identity protection is the tools that run machine learning across all your sign-ins and all your users, assigns them a risk score, and then you can build policies around that for the cloud identities.
Good. Next one we have on the list is Defender Vulnerability Management. And I'm only about halfway through the list here, folks, of defenders or defender adjacent items, right? And so with vulnerability management, we have security posture tracking with vulnerability tracking, right?
Yeah. So Defender Vulnerability Management is a part of Defender for Endpoint, but there is also an extra add-on that you can pay for that gives you some more spotting, including it will spot all the browser extensions that everybody's using and has risk scores for those. And it will also find out if you have any expiring certificates on endpoints. But vulnerability management in itself is something that some enterprises pay big money to third parties for. It basically will inventory all the software installed on all your endpoints, and which in this case includes Mac OS, Windows, I think Linux is in there now as well.
Wow.
And then it will tell you, out of all the products you have installed, these are all the CVEs that are associated with the versions you've got. Here's a way of tracking which ones you need to patch first, because those are the ones that are, let's say, internet exposed, or they are on high value machines. And there's also a CVE here that you need to go and patch. So that's the overall vulnerability management. And essentially, if you're a small business, it is an incredibly overwhelming list, because there are literally thousands of things you need to deal with.
Yeah, I would say SMB or even mid-market business, I would say too, is just that's kind of a theme I have with all of these, right? Is you kind of need a dedicated security team
Yeah.
to properly leverage these. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in a second here. But continuing on with our list here, next we got Defender for IoT, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? So it's protection for Internet of Things environments. And of course, I have a lot of background in my MSP days in working with manufacturers who love to use things like programmable logic controllers, PLCs, which are IoT devices. These are devices with usually very dumb operating systems on them. They are internet connected and are rarely ever looked at a second time after setup, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's great that there's a Defender specifically for IoT devices because I think it's sorely needed.
Yeah. Only thing I'd add there is that it also covers OT technology, so operational technology, so sort of your factory with all the machines in it that are talking to some sort of centralized thing. Again, an acquisition quite a few years ago. Great solution. I've actually taught courses on it, and it is being used in the real world quite extensively. And it, of course, feeds into the overall Defender suite. So, yeah, if you have that scenario, this is a good solution.
So the next three on the list, we'll kind of go through here quickly. Some of them need no introduction, but these are what I'm calling the Defender adjacent services. And this is one thing I noticed during my exercise looking at all of these. If I'm a system admin and I'm getting ready to provide some of the protections that I'm looking for with these tools, sometimes it's difficult to know what is contained within the particular Defender I'm looking for, or sometimes that feature I'm looking for lives in Entra, or it lives in Purview, right? It lives somewhere else that is not immediately apparent, right? Which adds to the confusion of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the first one on the list here I have is, I still want to call it Azure AD, but of course it is Microsoft Entra, which is the identity mechanism that underpins the entire Microsoft Cloud ecosystem, right? And of course, all of the identity protections that come along with that. You kind of mentioned it a little bit already, Paul. Anything you'd add before we move on?
Nope. Let's move on.
Yep. Next on the list is Microsoft Purview, which basically spans data security, governance, compliance. I think it's more heavy on the governance and compliance side of things because that's where some of your encryption management is going to be. That's where your DLP related stuff is. It's amazing. I feel like every week I look, some new thing has been sucked into Purview. Just my perception.
Well, they're doing a lot of work in Purview. Purview is a lot big. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on it, basically.
Oh, yeah.
You've mentioned the the information protection and the data loss prevention, but you also got to see that not only spans across your documents, that live in Team and SharePoint and are locally on people's machines and everything else. It also scans across your data stores in all the three major clouds. It scans across databases. So if you've got some database, open source database running in AWS, you can scan that for sensitive PII information, for example, and label it. So there is a whole lot more in there from an identity governance. And it is adjacent to Defender. We have one more Defender that we have missed, Defender for Cloud Apps.
Oh, you're right. I missed that one.
Yep.
Which is basically a CASB, right?
But it's a cloud access security broker, Defender for Cloud Apps. So this is the one that manages all your SaaS apps. It will identify your shadow IT usage, so all the users in your organization that are using SaaS apps that you don't know about in the IT team. You can govern them, you can unsanction them, so people can't get to them. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. Again, an acquisition, and it's a very powerful tool. But again, it's you can be a person who just spends all day in Defender for Cloud Apps. There's a lot you can do in there.
Right. Which I'm going to come back to that point. There's the last one on the list I want to mention that is Defender adjacent, I would say. And this one's still in public preview, and that is Microsoft SharePoint Premium. And my whole point in mentioning this one is SharePoint has its own attack surface, right? And this adds some governance type features to SharePoint. I think the big rub that I think a lot of people are going to have with it is it is yet another add-on license.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In an ecosystem that is already rife with add-on licenses and multiple packages and confusion, right?
Yeah.
Again, take a look at that licensing episode, folks. But
Yeah.
yeah, anything you want to add about SharePoint Premium before we
No, but
move
before
on
we
to
move
our next
on, I do want to
talking
make
point?
one clarification here.
Sure.
Defender for Cloud is not the same thing as Defender for Cloud Apps. So we talked
Right.
about how Microsoft is bad at naming. This is a Defender, but it's got nothing to do with all the other Defenders. This is the thing that lives in Azure and protects all your Azure resources, so your PaaS services and your IaaS, VMs and stuff in the cloud. The reason it's called Defender for Cloud is because it also does the same thing for AWS and GCP. So, and you can also use it as part of protecting your own endpoints servers on premises using Defender for Cloud protection going down to your endpoint machines. So or your
And
server.
see, I've been living in this space for like the last 2 or 3 weeks, and even I'm still having a hard time keeping it all straight.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. This is a big absolutely.
Yeah, which brings me to Microsoft Defender XDR, right? And of course, we've seen the big industry push for EDR all the things. Well, now the industry thing to do is to XDR all the things, right? And of course, XDR is exactly what it sounds like. It is a combination of multiple different defenders that we've discussed already, right? And so it includes things like the Microsoft Entra ID protections, data loss prevention, so some of the stuff from Purview I talked about, app governance, and then Microsoft Defender for Cloud, which you just talked about. So,
yeah. And so the point, I suppose, so extended detection and response is saying, look, you got EDR on all your endpoints, as you mentioned. Now we want to bring it all together in a single solution so that the attackers might send you a phishing email, right? And then that might slip through your defenses, ends up on an endpoint, then moves laterally. Now that touches Active Directory, then moves to the cloud and starts touching SharePoint. Well, if you have separate solutions for all of those individual protections, if they don't talk to each other, it's much harder for the SOC analyst to try to identify what actually happened in this attack. Whereas if you XDR them all, whether they're Microsoft or somebody else's products, if they're all connected, you can see a holistic picture of the type of attack chain that I just talked about, because all of those different products know about each other and talk to each other, basically. And that's what XDR is.
Right. And again, that assumes XDR is a very heavy lift. I would argue that any of these is a very heavy lift for your non-enterprise organizations, right? That have a dedicated security team that can sit down and give each of these the amount of time and attention that they require. And so that aside, there's a couple of other big headaches I want to talk about really quick. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of stuff in here that's really good, but we also have some other things that some common things that I see people in the community talk about frequently. The management sprawl.
Mm-hmm.
The management sprawl is a big one. I have lost track. I think the last number I heard was there are 17 plus different management portals in the Microsoft Cloud ecosystem.
Yep, that sounds about right.
So
there might be an 18th starting next week, but who knows?
Right. So, like, if I'm an admin and a ticket comes across my desk, and okay, well, for this thing, I think I have to do it in the Entra management portal. Wait, no, I have to go over to the Exchange portal. No, I have to in this Defender one over here, and it becomes a real headache, right? So, not only do you have to understand how the features and solutions work, you also have to understand, like, just the minutia of which portal do I need to go to actually manage this thing, right?
Yeah, that is absolutely true. I would say, though, that part of that is a simple function of the fact that these are enterprise products. Yes, I know they're doing business premium to smaller businesses and whatever, and Microsoft is trying their best to try to make them accessible to smaller businesses and, a busy all-in-one IT admin like me. But the reality is that there are all these portals because they are in big organizations. There are literally different teams that don't have access to each other's portals, literally, like they don't even have permissions in there. So in those scenarios, you've got your one or two portals because that's all your team ever does, right? And if there's a problem, you hand it over in a ticket to some other team somewhere else to deal with, right? So, and secondly, Microsoft does have the XDR portal. So we mentioned the name before, but that is what's used to be called Microsoft 365 Defender, which is now Defender XDR. And that is the single portal where they are bringing in Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Cloud Apps, Defender for Office 365, Defender for Identity, Defender, I think I covered all of them. Defender for IoT feeds in there as well. The vulnerability management bit feeds in there as well. And if you're using Microsoft Sentinel, which is their cloud-based SIEM in there, it can also live in the same portal. So at least you have a single portal for most of those things. So they are trying to integrate it. But as you said, there are times when you have to go to any of those other portals.
Right. Do you know off the top of your head how the licensing for Defender XDR works? Is it like an E5 only type of thing, I'm guessing?
No. So you got Business Premium, you get the Defender. Well, like everybody gets the Defender portal. You can always go to security.microsoft.com. It's just that certain things won't be lit up. You won't see them. So you're on Business Premium, and I'm not mentioning Business Standard here because it doesn't have any security features in it, really.
Right.
So, but your Business Premium, you get the Defender XDR portal, but of course it's missing a whole bunch of stuff.
Right.
If you're on Microsoft 365 E3, you get some, which is basically P1 across all the different things we talked about. You don't get Defender for Identity at all, and you get a very basic Defender for Cloud Apps Discovery. So it'll sort of tell you what your people are using, but you can't apply any policies to them or block any SaaS apps. And then, or at least not in the built-in product. And then you have Microsoft 365 E5, which gives you nearly everything, all the bells and whistles. And then there is a couple of add-ons that you can add on top that then gives you the full picture in the one security portal.
E5 compliance, E5 security, right?
Exactly. I do want to mention one thing here so that everybody understands why it is, well, apart from Microsoft being a capitalist company and trying to make money. But apart from that, the reason is that if you're an organization today who say, we use another identity provider, right? We're using Okta or, I don't know, one of the other identity providers. We're not going to use Entra ID. So we're going to have, say, Active Directory on premises. We're going to hook it up to Okta, not to anything else. Then you go, well, we certainly don't need Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 because we don't need those security products. And we're going to buy our security suite from somebody else. We're going to buy CrowdStrike or SentinelOne or somebody else. And we're going to buy a different cloud-based SIEM, a different cloud-based CASB. And we're happy to do the work to integrate those. Some of those sort of come pre-integrated now. Then you say, well, we would still want to use Office, as in, like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, and SharePoint, and we want to SharePoint Online, and we want to do Teams, and we want to do the collaboration, but we want to outsource everything else. So in those scenarios, you literally buy Office 365 E3 or E5, and then you buy all your security products from somebody else. Or you say, we want some of our security products from third party, but we want some from Microsoft. And now you end up in a situation where you either buy the E3 or E5 or the E5 security or the E5 compliance licensing and then not use bits of it, even though you've paid for it, or you buy a la carte. So maybe you don't pay for the suite, but you pay for Microsoft 365 E3, which gives you the basic security bits, and then you buy some bits on, individual licensing SKU basis rather than a suite.
And last I looked, buying a la carte, I mean, you're paying a little bit more per item you buy, if I remember correctly, because you're not getting that bundled discount, right?
That's right. But if you only need a few, but you don't need all of them, right?
Right.
I mean, I don't know what the statistics are. Microsoft probably does. But if you look at across everybody who has Microsoft 365 E3, every organization, how many of the features that is built in do they actually use? It's not going to be 100%. And if you're going for Microsoft 365 E5 and you go, how many of those features are people using? There's probably going to be an even lower percentage because there's a lot there, right? And the reality is also not every organization optimizes licensing 1,000%. Maybe that's not the most important thing. They might have a team that says, hey, we've been using DLP solution X for the last 5 years, and we're really happy with it. We know how to use it. We don't care that you've paid for another DLP solution. We're not going to migrate. We're going to stick with this one, right? So
Right.
now you have another integration situation because you want those DLP alerts to show up alongside every other alert you have. So, more work.
I'm glad you brought up the licensing example, because I feel like in my travels, I've seen the vast majority of customers I've talked with, they fall into I'm going to use some of the stuff inside of 365 or the Microsoft cloud, some of the Microsoft security stuff, and then I'm going to use some external third parties, right?
Yeah.
And that conversation comes up a lot, like, hey, I'm paying for, let's use E5 as an example, because it's the penultimate example, right? It has everything, right? And so that comes up a lot. It's like, hey, I'm already paying for it. Like, I guess there's a mental hurdle to get over there, in that I'm going to not take advantage of this thing that I'm paying for. And you kind of alluded to it already, is like, if you go look at the average business that has E5, and again, I don't have numbers, I have to believe there is little to nobody that is utilizing it to its 100% capability, right?
Yeah, I think that's realistic. And if they're a really big organization and maybe some parts of the organization use some parts of the full suite, but they're not doing it across the whole business, because it's
Right.
a lot. It's a lot. Like it is literally hey, here's the suite that contains everything. And then the IT team goes, oh my God, this is so many projects to get this happening. And a lot of these things are also, it's not an IT thing, right? Remember, we're talking about people,
Yeah.
process, and technology. This is just a technology bit. You still need the people and processes on board. You need to train your users. You need to configure the thing correctly. And there's a lot in that, like a lot in that.
There is, for sure. For sure. And that kind of brings me to the next part I want to talk about, is like, okay, how do I want to say it? The question comes up a lot in that situation I just mentioned, where like, hey, they've already licensed some security features. What's the value that a third party brings? And the big thing that I always bring up, and we've talked about it a little bit already during this discussion, is the difficulty of the lift of getting any of these off the ground and running, let alone the day-to-day management. They're designed for the mega enterprises of the world, right? And so if you're an SMB or a mid-sized business, it's going to be really difficult for you to leverage these tools effectively. And that's where I would argue that's one of the big values that a third-party solution can bring, right? And so, again, I try to not do product pitches on our show, but we do have a competing product for Defender for Office 365, right? So here at Hornet, we provide email security solutions for 365. And one of the big values that we bring to the table for those customers is we make it really stupid easy, just super easy. And, there's one central console that you log into and you do everything from there. And so that time-strapped administrator that, the data center is half burning down around them and they're just trying to get through the day, well, you can log into our solution and actually get some stuff done, as opposed to stumbling around until you find your management portal and then doing whatever it is you have to do, right? So that's one of the values that I see a third party bring. The other thing that I argue all the time is we focus on security. As a security vendor, that's all we do. And so our detection mechanisms tend to be higher. I would also argue the fact that Microsoft, being who they are, makes them a target.
Yeah.
And so if I'm a threat actor, I know that if I can beat Defender security once, I can do it for anyone using Defender, whereas a third party, that may not be the case, right? And then the other thing that always comes up is, I think we've talked about this on the show before too, is that whole concept of vendor over dependence, right? Yeah. There's this very real risk in the last year or two that's been talked about a lot, where if I'm a business and I am leveraging company X, Microsoft in this case, for 80% of my IT needs, what happens when that company has issues, right? And
Yeah.
so you're starting to see a lot of companies make the deliberate decision to involve more vendors in some cases to avoid that over dependence issue, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll stop talking now so you can get a word in, Paul.
No, all good points. I completely agree with them. I would add two more things. Again, we're trying not to shill our products here, but Permission Manager is a very unique product from Hornet Security and gives you incredibly powerful governance of SharePoint. I have not seen anything, including in SharePoint Premium. I have not seen a solution from anybody, whether Microsoft or anybody else, that comes close to Permission Manager. It is a very, very, very cool product that does something fairly unique in the market. So if you're worried, if you're a CISO and you're worried about, sharing documents are shared from your organization out with whoever on the internet, that's the tool for you, and it's a great tool to help you with that. And I suppose I would also mention backup. I mean, that's another nice thing that got built into some of our plans is the backup of Microsoft 365. So backing up, your Exchange mailboxes and your SharePoint stuff and your Teams and your planner and everything else. So it's kind of cool that it's in there, and that's helpful as well in case
For sure.
wrong.
And same thing applies. We take all the work out of it. Well, as much work as you can feasibly take out of it, right? And so, because we want it to be easy, we know those time-strapped admins that are working in SMBs and mid-markets, they need some help, man.
Yeah,
they do. Yep, for sure. So, well, Paul, did we miss anything? I think we got through our whole list here, and we're about out of time, I think.
I think we've covered everything. I mean, the reality is that as a defender, you want to sit down and you want to look at what do we actually need. It might be easy to just go with the default if you can talk your management into buying the expensive solution, but you do really want to sit down. Does this actually give us the protection we need? And right. It's better to go with a third party that gives us the simplicity. Because the reality is, it's an organization called Attack IQ. I know I'm going to shield somebody else, but anyway, they're a great organization. They provide threat-informed defense, meaning they have automation tools to test your defenses. So you say, yeah, we catch phishing emails and we do this and we do that, blah, blah, blah. And you've got a list of all the things you think you do. And then you run these automated tests against your organization and you get a report back. And you go, oh, that thing is misconfigured. That thing doesn't send an alert to where it's meant to send an alert. This thing has the wrong threshold, so we didn't catch that, right? Because the reality is that everybody thinks that their security products are doing 100% the way they think they are meant to be doing it and they're all configured correctly. Well, the reality in the real world is that it's not really like that, right? So having a simpler tool to deploy with less knobs to mess up, sure. Which Defender XDR definitely isn't, is a great benefit.
Exactly. And if I put myself back in the trenches, there have been a couple of times where the situation I'm thinking of is a Hyper-V situation. I had a customer that they bought System Center VMN for a 2-host cluster.
Oh my God.
And they want me to, it's overkill. I tried telling them, you don't need this, at all. And for those that don't know, System Center, somebody who's not familiar with Hyper-V, people see System Center Virtual Machine Manager as the vCenter equivalent, right? And it's not. In some degrees it is, but it's not when you get right down to it.
If you have a big environment, it is the equivalent. If you got 40 hosts in 5 different clusters or something and hundreds and hundreds of VMs, it's sort of the equivalent.
Has to be a big environments. I've seen clusters of, I've seen multi-cluster environments of 20 hosts run completely fine without SCVMM.
Yeah.
But anyway, bringing that back to the Defender discussion here, right? Sometimes that third party just makes it easy. You reduce the risk of misconfiguration because you're not hitting a fly with a bazooka,
Yeah, that's a good description. I like that.
Anyway,
I think we give that to Monty Python there.
That's right.
With bazookas. Yep.
That's right. So I think that's a good spot for us to stop. So, Paul, I want to thank you for spending some time with us today and bringing all of your extensive M365 knowledge. We're 38 minutes in, and I'm losing the ability to speak. So that means it's time to end. So thanks for being here, my friend.
No, no worries. This was good.
Definitely. And those of you watching, thanks for spending some time with us today. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to smash that like and subscribe button. Otherwise, you can find us on all the major podcasting platforms. So chances are you can find us wherever you consume your content. With that, we'll let you get back to your day. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you again next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Have a good one.